In this chapter, we'll take a look at motivation and emotion. We'll define what they are, what is the difference between them, and how are they related. So first of all, let's define motivation and emotion. So motivation is defined as biological, emotional, cognitive, or social forces that activate and direct behavior. Now, if you'll notice, I did put in red font these terms, biological, emotional, cognitive, or social. And the reason I did that is just because I wanted to bring to your awareness and help you to focus on the idea that motivation actually is comprised of each of these components. Okay, so moving on. What is emotion? So emotion is defined as a psychological state involving subjective experience, physiological response, and behavioral or expressive response. So let's proceed here. So a couple different types of motivation that you should be aware of is what's known as intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So what is the difference between those? So intrinsic motivation is basically motivation from within oneself, within the individual. And so things, like, a sense of autonomy, mastery over skills, or knowledge, having a purpose in life, that's intrinsic motivation that comes from within the individual. Now, on the other hand, extrinsic motivation comes from outside of the individual. So that can be things, like striving to get compensation, to get paid, to get a reward, or to avoid punishment, that kind of thing. So that's extrinsic motivation. Now, some of that might sound a little familiar in regard to our discussion in an earlier chapter about learning and different types of motivations involved with learning. Let's just leave it at that. So first of all, William James, we're talking about different theories of motivation now. So William James, one of the early American psychologists, he proposed the theory known as instinct theory of motivation. And he proposed that basically, one's behavior is driven by instincts. So, that can be, instincts can come from evolution, or, one's striving to survive or succeed, things like that. So just kind of keep that in mind. That is one type of theory that has been proposed over the years. So there are basically three characteristics associated with motivation, and those are known as activation, persistence, and intensity. So let's take a look at each one of those first. So activation, that refers to the idea that basically is when a motivation is first initiated or actually initiates or produces behavior. Okay, so activation, that's when an emotion is first kind of felt. Okay, so we'll take a look at the second term here, intensity. That means, basically the vigor of the response that usually accompanies a behavior, a motivated behavior. So put in simpler terms, intensity just means, how strong, the response, that one is feeling when one is motivated. So sometimes, one may be motivated to, just get, maybe get a snack, have a small, a little meal or something, that, one might not be really hungry, super hungry, but just a small snack, excuse me. And so that can be a less vigorous response that accompanies that motivated behavior. On the other hand, when one hasn't eaten for 2 days and one is very hungry and needs to eat, in order to survive, that can be a much stronger intensity. Okay, last but not least here, we'll take a look at the term persistence. So when one is motivated, one may basically exhibit continued effort or determination to achieve their particular goal. So persistence, I don't think we need to elaborate too much further on that, but basically persistence, just when you think of that term, think of continued effort or determination. Now we'll take a look here at another theory here, which is known as incentive theory. Okay, and so basically, incentive theories or of motivation, that just means basically one is motivated by certain incentives or goals. Okay, so definitely, take for instance a few of the notes I put here. Behavior is motivated by the pull of external goals, such as rewards, money, recognition, that type of thing. Another theory is what's known as arousal theory. So that just means, basically, in order to be motivated, one needs to arrive at what's known as optimal levels of stimulation. So basically, people, because, as we talked about a little bit earlier about, intensity and that type of thing. So people, they experience along a spectrum, different levels of arousal. So, they can go from very low on the spectrum to very high on the spectrum. And so definitely what has been determined, psychologists have determined that very low levels and very high levels of arousal are actually both can be quite unpleasant for the individual. So, taking that a little bit further, when arousal is too low, one might experience boredom and strive to increase their level of arousal. They'll say, look, I want to have more fun with this, or I want to be more engaged. And so they're trying to raise their level of arousal. On the other hand, when arousal is a little too high, we'll seek to reduce it. And because there's just too much stimuli, there's too much going on. One is too, the intensity level is much too high to deal with. So I put in red here. I just want to keep you aware. So what the point of this is in general, individuals, we are generally motivated to maintain, optimal levels of arousal. So, we just want to kind of, kind of be somewhere in the middle on the spectrum. It's not too high, not too low. Okay, so feel free to pause the video, take a look at this chart right here that I showed here. And the point of this is right here, is this sentence right here, that optimal performance, is usually maximized, at the optimal level of arousal. And remember, that's right in the middle right here. That's right here on this curve at the very top. This is, you can see, this is somewhere along the middle of the spectrum right here. Okay, so not too high, not too low, but somewhere right in the middle. And usually optimal levels of performance are achieved when one is at optimal levels of intensity and arousal. Okay, so that's just kind of a repeat of what we just discussed. So moving forward here. Now, what's known as the humanistic theory, that was by Rogers and Maslow. They were some of the major proponents of this type of thinking, of this type of theoretical analysis. And so, anyway, basically, they said that human potential is can be a motivator for individuals as well. So basically, all that means is humans, we tend to be motivated, strongly in order to fulfill our personal potential. We want to achieve everything we're capable of achieving. And so these two individuals, Rogers and Maslow, they were the two major proponents of this idea right here, of this theory right here. So let's move forward just a little bit. So as you may remember from the previous slide, we mentioned an individual named Maslow. And Maslow basically has been well known for developing what's called the hierarchy of needs. And so basically, it looks like a pyramid right here. And so basically what Maslow proposed is this. If we start at the bottom of the pyramid, the largest part, what he proposed is individuals must basically kind of move from level to level in order. So in order to, take for instance, one must fulfill one's physiological needs, like food, water, shelter, warmth, before one can start becoming concerned with like the next sets of needs, like social, that kind of thing. And so this actually, kind of results in a hierarchy, hence the hierarchy of needs. So it's interesting though is these days, this isn't a really hard and fast kind of rule type scenario. That actually what psychologists have determined and have proposed, like, look, this isn't set. So when one actually achieves, one gets up to the highest levels of needs, like what is known as self-actualization, achieve inner fulfillment, that, that one doesn't stay there for the rest of one's life. One can actually, in other scenarios, exist at other levels of this hierarchy. So keep in mind, though, that this, basically my point is that one must keep in mind that this hierarchy of needs is in a constant state of flux throughout one's life. So one definitely, on a certain phase of one's life, one might have to be more concerned about their safety and their employment and their, monetary assets and things like that, the security level. And one may be concerned with that and striving to achieve security in this phase right here before one can actually, basically become, concerned with and direct one's efforts towards any of these other levels right here. So just keep that in mind, please. And I actually did put this other chart in here, and it's basically kind of very similar to the one we just looked at. But I definitely like the way this is laid out here, and I thought you might appreciate that as well. So feel free to pause and kind of look at this and think about this and how this affects maybe your life, and see if you agree with some of this. Okay, so if you remember from our previous slide here talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very top level, the highest level on the hierarchy is what was called self-actualization. So what does that mean? What are, characteristics of self-actualized people? And so here are some of the characteristics here that are known to be evident in self-actualized people. And so, things like realism, self-acceptance, being able to be spontaneous, have a sense of autonomy, things like that. So just kind of, feel free to pause here, look at these, get a little more insight into these, and I'm going to proceed in order to save us some time here. Okay, so when we another type of motivation that we looked at, might have been what was called innate needs, if you remember that from an earlier discussion here. And so definitely, like hunger, and which also relates to eating. Those are regulated by a complex interplay of signals, that are integrated in the brain. So I did put this chart here because I wanted you to see this, that one, feels hunger, one actually interprets one's feelings and interprets those as hunger. And so that actually occurs in the brain right here. So one actually, as a result, one's behavior will result in searching for food. So one, initially feels hunger in the brain, and then one searches for food. And once one gets some food into one's stomach, right here, that is the level known as, satiety. And basically that just means satisfaction, satiety of that certain impulse, that motivation to get food and feel, and as a result of one's feeling hungry. And we're going to kind of elaborate a little bit upon some of these, about hunger and eating. So what are some of the psychological factors that trigger eating? And well, you'll remember from previous discussions on conditioning and learning, we use the term classical conditioning. So how does classical conditioning, what does that have to do with your eating schedule, with your eating habits? Well, take for instance, the time of day that you normally eat. If you have usually, say, if you find yourself saying, look, I always eat lunch exactly at 12 o'clock noon, that kind of thing. Well, that's the result of actually classical conditioning. And then, other things, like, levels of insulin, glucose, increased body temperature, decreased metabolism, that kind of thing. Those are all involved in classical conditioning. Now, if you remember, operant conditioning was the result of maybe having goals, achieving one's goals in order to, condition one's behavior in order to arrive at one's goals, achieve one's goals. And so that can be like preference for, operant conditioning. How does that relate to eating and hunger? Well, when one feels like a preference for certain tastes, like when one wants sweet food or salty food, that kind of thing. Well, that's the result of operant conditioning, because that's more specific, goal-oriented behavior. Okay, so briefly here we'll discuss another type of motivation that exists in humans, and that is sexual motivation. So definitely, psychologists, I put this in red here, they consider the drive of, sex drive to have sex, it's a basic human motive. And so that's why, we're well aware of, in advertising on media and everything, quite often our basic human motive, to have, a sex and a sex drive, those are actually used in advertising because those are basic human motives that are kind of, I'm not going to say taken advantage of, but those are definitely used in order to influence us. Okay, so definitely, on a deeper level, so what motivates our impulse to, our sexual impulses, sexual behaviors? So a couple of things here, like number one, definitely survival of the species. So, we have a basic impulse, to engage in behavior that results in survival of our human species. So that's one of them. Definitely hormonal changes, are responsible for sexual motivation and behavior. And then last but not least here, I did say, don't forget that learning and our environmental influences, especially for humans, have a little bit of play in our sexual behavior. As we mentioned, like media influence and things like that. Okay, so from a neuroscientific, paradigm right here, we're just going to take a look at, basically some of the areas of the brain, that are involved in sexual, motivation. So some of the, important structures of the brain that are involved in sexual behavior are right here. I listed these. The amygdala and the nucleus accumbens are involved in motivation for sexual behavior. So here's the amygdala right here, and here's the nucleus accumbens right here. And so those are two known structures, parts of the neuroscientific architecture that are involved with motivating us to motivating our sexual drives or behaviors. Okay, and while we're on the topic here, it is, it might be, important to just kind of consider, well, what about sexual orientation then? So we have, we're known to have basic motives for sexual engagement and behavior, but how does our sexual orientation, how does that relate to that? Does anything, and so definitely, well, they've determined, researchers have determined that things like genetics, okay, and prenatal environment, so, things like that, and then last but not least, brain structure. So differences, in the hypothalamus and the amygdala, between homosexual and heterosexual men, that kind of thing. So basically, there are biological, basic, components or reasons, for, that determine one's sexual orientation. And last but not least here, we'll wrap this up, and just, with this part of this discussion. And here are some of the other findings in regard to sexual orientation. So, definitely, more often than not, sexual orientation that's usually determined before adolescence and before the, sexual activity actually begins, and that might be the result of, the prenatal hormonal type influences that it has. Okay, so let's shift gears here and talk about self-determination. When one is determined to achieve one's potential or goals or whatever. And so these individuals, these are the most current researchers involved in what they have termed self-determination theory, and that is DECI and Ryan, their self-determination theory. And their self-determination theory that proposed that, people were naturally, actively, we are growth oriented. We want to fulfill our potential and reach our goals. and that we usually move toward self-integration, and stuff. So with things like that. So I'm going to leave that, and we will move on from there. So DECI and Ryan, they propose that 3 innate and universal psychological needs must be satisfied. Okay, and so one strives for a sense of autonomy. Basically say, look, I can make my own choices. I can determine what's going to happen with my life. That is a sense of autonomy. And then second, individuals, we strive for a sense of competence. We want to feel like, hey, not only am I capable, of, achieving my goals, but I'm completely, I've got the skills that it takes. I'm extremely capable, and so that refers to competence. And then last but not least, a sense of relatedness. That what one is striving, one's basic. How can I put this? Basic sense of what one is and what one does and everything relates to the environment in a positive way. That one is not completely on one's own. That one is definitely experiences a sense of relatedness. So a few different types of motivation here are known as competence motivation and achievement motivation. So first of all, competence motivation, that basically means that's when people strive to use their skills to be capable and exercise control. So they are strongly, they are highly competent. Okay. Now, the second type of motivation was achievement motivation. And that means that's the drive to excel, succeed, or outperform others. So it's a little bit of, maybe even a little competitiveness, possibly. Now, culturally speaking, this is important, but culture definitely influences different types of motivation and one's behaviors. And so first of all, it has, been determined, that individualistic cultures, that is, cultures like from the West, generally speaking, Western culture and everything are a little more individualistic, and that focuses on, those in individualistic cultures, they tend to focus on their individual success, rather than on the group. And they're usually a little more competitive, between themselves and others. On the other hand, collectivistic cultures, they're a little more, oriented to, social harmony and promoting one's group and or one's family. So just kind of keep that in mind, how one's culture has an influence on one's motivational type procedures and impulses. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here. So we've spent, so far we've spent this time talking about motivation. Now we're going to take a look at emotion. So definitely, we can see here, that definitely, toddlers, they go through emotions quickly. They can be really happy and smiling one moment and then crying and really sad and afraid or something the very next moment. And they, and that's actually the result of brain maturation, the maturing of their brains. And that actually evolves as they get older. And little by little, they will start to experience a little less of an emotional reaction, and will start employing things like logic and things like that. but that takes some time in the human evolution. So first of all, let's just we're gonna kind of define what emotion is, and keep in mind here the key word here is psychological. It's a psychological state. So when one is feeling emotions, that is actually is a psychological impulse that one experiences, and then they might experience a physiological response afterward, so as a result of. Now, I did put here, I just wanted to be aware of the difference between, emotions and moods. So a mood, is a much milder, emotional state. It's more general, such as, feeling overall just kind of sad or happy even or something. That's a mood. But an emotion is a lot more complex. That involves, physiological response, their experience or subjective experience, all that. It's a little more complex than just a mood. So first of all, why do we even have emotions? What are they? Why do we? What are the functions of emotions? So I put a few of these down here just for you to see. So definitely today's cognitive psychologists, they say, look, emotions, they actually initiate our actions. They move us to act and set goals and make decisions. So they definitely inspire our actions and decisions. Okay, and then second here, I want you to be aware though that because remember that is a psychological, phenomenon. Emotions are psychologically, are psychological phenomenons that remember psychological means mental processes, and mental processes occur as a result of basically brain type processes. Okay, and so I wanted to make you aware and keep in mind the fact that an individual can actually experience damage to parts of their brains, as a result of accidents or something, mishaps. And that can result in actually, because there's damage to certain parts of the brain, the individuals can lose the capacity to feel emotions. Okay. So, remember emotion, is a result of psychological processes. Okay, so we did mention, subjective experience of emotion, so basically, basically, I would just like for you to, pause the video here, read through this here. I'm not going to read through all these. I decided that, we're going to save us a little time here and move on. Okay, so briefly here, I did include this in our discussion because I just want you to be aware of what is called the two-factor theory of emotion. Two-factor theory of emotion. So on the basically the two factors are listed here. So what this individual, the arousal here is the snake right here. Okay. And then the two factors here can be, like take for instance, in this first theory right here, when one sees the snake, one might experience the physiological process, of heart pounding and start breaking into a sweat. And then the emotion they will feel is fear. So here are the two factors. right here, heart pounding, and then leading to fear, emotion. Okay, so that's is the two-factor theory of emotion. So basically, these researchers have proposed that basically one experiences the immediate physiological response to something like a snake or something that one will be afraid of, but one will experience these physiological type responses first, leading to the psychological emotion, which is fear. And let's briefly just talk about neuroscience of emotion. So what goes on, in the brain, definitely. So, one thing, is, to keep in mind, different emotions, those actually stimulate different responses, in the individual, like physiologically speaking, and responses within the brain. So definitely when one experiences things, like fear and anger and everything, that actually can, kind of initiate responses within the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. And then those, those responses from within the sympathetic nervous system, those can be things, like, if one is in a state of fear, experience, like a decrease in skin temperature. Whereas, like, say, anger, they will have an increase in skin temperature, things like that. Also, other things, like, there's a lot of responses, but definitely heart pounding, breathing, increasing or decreasing. Levels of certain types of chemicals within the brain, that, cause, certain responses to occur or emotions to occur. So one thing that's important to keep in mind, is, the part of the brain, the structure of the brain called the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system. You may have remembered this from our discussions, early discussions on neuroscience. But the amygdala, that is what activates when something is threatening. Like seeing something that one is afraid of, or even hearing sounds, that are. So that is the part of the brain that actually activates and sends signals to one's prefrontal cortex, which results in, individuals, their prefrontal cortex will say, okay, I need to run, or I need to protect myself, fight or flight. So I'm going to do this, and one will have a response. Well, that is a result of, the amygdala communicating with the prefrontal cortex, and then the prefrontal cortex, initiates the plan of action. So a couple things, just wanted to make you aware of some, kind of like FYI type information, but definitely, it has been found that, say, take for instance, humans, with a damaged amygdala, they have what's known as psychic blindness. Okay. And basically all that means is the inability to recognize fear in facial expressions and voices of others. So they just they're not capable of recognizing fear when others are experiencing fear because their amygdalas are damaged. And I did include this here because I just wanted you to see that there's actually a lot of the, parts of the brain, a lot of structures in the brain that work together, interdependently in order to basically, initiate and manage, emotional type response. Okay, and so all these structures right here, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, these all work together in the emotional impulse and response. Now, I just wanted you to see, for those of you who are interested in seeing images, from the neuroscientific perspective of brains, and these are scans when an individual is feeling different emotions. And you can see right here that, take for instance, on the upper left here, when one is experiencing sadness, the parts in red right here are, basically highly active. But then when one is experiencing happiness, on the other hand, a different part of the brain is active, etc., etc. Now keep in mind here, that we are able to, if the parts of those functions that we talked about emotional regulation and being able to recognize emotions within other individuals, if those are, not damaged and are very functional, then we will actually we'll be able to recognize, facial expressions when we look at others. And what's important this is kind of interesting, but there are 7 universal facial expressions of emotion, which means basically no matter what culture one comes from, one actually, that all humans express emotions in similar ways. Like happiness, for instance, usually is accompanied by a smile, and sadness, on the other hand, kind of tends to look like this, and etc., etc. So these are universal facial expressions that accompany certain emotions. And so that concludes our discussion about motivation and emotion. So I hope you found this insightful. Exactly, what is motivation? What are the different types of motivation? And same thing with emotions. So that concludes our discussion.